When that technology bubble was a big one. 2001, when 9/11 happened, that was another big one. The main reason is, first of all, it shook the nation. Number two, they shut down the airports, so there was no planes flying for 2 weeks. So it had a major disruption in the industry. And 2001 as a whole became one of the historical bad years. And I'm sure that to no less effect of that. But anyway, that was a different situation, right? That wasn't one that had a natural cycle. It was a major disruption.
Right.
But every other one but 2001 came first. And you can sense it. You really can, especially when you have trucks and you start to see their miles ebb and flow. It took 8 months for us to sense a change in the marketplace. When 2008-09 started to shift downward, somewhere in the neighborhood of June of 2009, we started to see some life, and then it slowly began heading north. We're now 14 months into this, and we see no end in sight.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back to Finance and Liberty and Reluctant Preppers. We have a first-time guest today who's well-positioned inside the trucking industry, who's been in the trucking industry for decades and knows the operation and the business from the ground up to the boardroom. He's seen major and significant changes happening over the past recent period of time. He's willing to come on and talk to us about the real indications of what's happening on the ground and what it might tell us about the strength of our economy and what it shows us about what's happened in the past as we approach the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and what they're seeing now. So thank you for joining us here on Reluctant Preppers.
Thanks, Dunagun. Glad to be here.
Hey, it was a big favor to us here when we got you to agree to come on the show because of your extensive experience in the trucking industry. We've heard many analysts here on our program, from Gregory Mannarino, Rob Kirby, and others, talking about a major disconnect that is happening between the physical economy and the major financial markets. And where our president and others seem to tout that we're in the greatest economy of all time, and the stock market undoubtedly has been breaking record after record. In fact, all the major market indices have been breaking records over the past several weeks and quarters. We've been hearing some significant concerns from what's actually happening in the real economy, and wonder if you could take us back to what you've seen in the past when we were approaching major recession. Specifically, we have a question from a viewer, LA1, who asks, how does the trucking industry react to a recession, and specifically during the last one in 2008, when the housing crash caused many of the construction workers and drivers to shift their interest into trucking, and how do small and local trucking companies do during these times?
That's a great question, Dunagun, and I think the first place to go, I think, would be that, being in trucking, you tend to expect the hills and the valleys of the market, right? So you're gonna, we've been dealing with the ups and downs of, many different facets of the economy as it drives trucking. Ultimately, if you dial it back to the early 90s when, you almost couldn't do anything wrong in trucking, the first major malfunction was, when the bubble happened, the technology bubble at the end of the 90s. So that was our first big experience on a downturn. So we learned a few things. One thing we learned is, when that happens in the economy, it affects both rates and the amount of miles that you can get for your drivers, and that's really what it boils down to from a trucking company economic standpoint. Because those are the couple things that drive, both your revenues, obviously, and your turnover in the driver market. And anybody in the trucking industry knows that turnover, is a big factor, in your ability to both keep drivers and attract new ones as you're attempting to grow. So when we got into the 2008 burst, if you will, when the bottom fell out in the housing market, something unique happened that we didn't experience in the past, and that's that the downturn started happening about, I guess in trucking it happened about October of 2008. And it lasted 8 months before there was a shift. And what I mean by shift is before you started to see a little bit of life back in the market. That was the first time it lasted as long in the last 25 years, where it was a straight slide. And the only way to weather that storm is to allow your natural attrition in what you lost in your revenues to affect your fleet. So turnover, you didn't replace it. So you basically allowed your natural attrition to kind of level out with the revenues and the customer demand that you have, which was about a 45% decline in a very short period of time. And obviously, you don't have 45% less fleet to work with, or 45% less expenses, to work with. So in the mid of 2008, when that began to turn, it actually turned a little bit on what we would call a false start, where you had less inventory of trucks in the marketplace with so many failures, which gave a rise to a demand that certainly did pick up in the manufacturing market, but it didn't. It wasn't necessarily because freight demand was up. It was just because mainly there was less fleet in the marketplace to run the demand.
Let me understand that. So because some trucking companies failed and went out of business, that for those that were survivors, the last ones standing were able to keep going because they had enough work?
Correct. So much so. I mean, there's one of the other indexes that we always look at basically is replacement on trucks. So the average age of the equipment out there in the marketplace, it gives us an idea how quick these large fleets out there are replacing their vehicles. Well, one of the phenomena that happened in 2008 and 9 was there was a holdback in replacement. So essentially, there's no 2010 model years out there on the road because no one was buying trucks in 2010. They're basically holding on to what they had, running the drivers that they could run in those trucks. So 2010 was kind of a recovery year from the 08-09 downturn. And it kind of obviously continued growing from there into 11 and 12. But to your point, there was less trucks on the road because of those failures. And so as soon as you've seen a slight turn, in demand, there were less trucks to run it. So it had this effect that it felt like things were improving, but it was really because there was less trucks on the road.
When you've talked about turnover here, are you talking about the drivers themselves?
In this case, I'm talking about replacing there's two kinds of turnover. You got your equipment turnover, and you have your drivers themselves, correct?
Mm-hmm. Okay. What were the signs you saw before the downturn in 2008, 2009, or was it just a bolt out of the blue and it just blindsided you and the whole industry?
Yeah, that was what made it different, Dunagun, is it was a blind side. Normally there's a slow degradation of demand. And subsequently, there tends to be a slow improvement. So you got the bookends, right? So as you're going into a slowdown, you start to sense it before the general economy does, and you see it coming because once volumes start to drop off, and we're heavily driven by the manufacturing world, both in the automotive side, it's certainly very heavy on the automotive side, but the various forms of manufacturing out there, both in raw materials and finished product, you start to see the slow slide. But, it's manageable typically because you can adjust to the slow slide, just like you can adjust when it starts to turn and start to come up. But in 2008, somewhere around the first to second week of October, literally within 30 days, so by the time we got into Thanksgiving time in 2008, about 45% of our volumes literally vanished. They were gone. So we had never seen such a dramatic decrease in the amount of time, in the short amount of time that it took. That's really, in my opinion, why it was so devastating, because you just can't react that quick.
We've heard, you mentioned manufacturing is a key driver. We've heard from several analysts over the past quarter and a half or so that month after month we've seen contraction in the manufacturing index in the U.S., so that real manufacturing is slowing, There are companies that are just pulling in their horns and not investing, not shipping as much. What are you seeing on the ground that correlating with that in terms of the volume of shipments that are happening now? What's been changing over the past couple of quarters?
Well, it's actually started back in November of 2018. That's when we started to see the shift. There was due to a number of different reasons, I think mainly with the tariff scare, that President Trump and China have been working on for, I guess now we're in phase one of hopefully some kind of change. But that started back in November. So there was this pull forward of inventory. And if you know anybody in the warehousing world, it was hard to find space as we were coming out of 2018 and getting into 2019. So a lot of these manufacturers were pulling inventory forward, trying to anticipate what they were going to need for the first quarter of 2019 so they can avoid any potential tariff increases. It made a lot of sense. It did affect the industry in most of November and the beginning part of December, until it settled down, until they brought in what they needed to bring in. But if we take out some of that pull forward and really look at the organic movement of the freight and how, and especially on the manufacturing side, with demand, it began to slide very noticeably in November of 2018. And that slide actually never stopped, and it continues today, actually. We had one of the worst Decembers of record. And matter of fact, if you look at one of the freight indexes that we spend a lot of time and effort looking at monthly, it's called the Cass Freight Index. Mm-hmm. And the reason it's so significant for those of your viewers that don't know it or have never subscribed to it, Cass is it's a freight audit and payment company that represents shippers, and they cover all the domestic freight modes in the United States, and they manage somewhere in the neighborhood of about 28 billion with a B in annual freight transactions for those customers. So they have a pretty good array of industries that they serve. So with that array, they post some information from those transactions to just help folks understand what's going on out there. And one of the alarming things that I saw in December was that some of the numbers that they put out there, and these go everything from truckload to manufacturing indexes, and truckload is the largest transportation mode out there in the United States. But they're seeing numbers that are getting back to 2009 again. And from our perspective, because of how long this has been happening, I spoke before about, it took 8 months for us to sense a change in the marketplace. When 2008-09 started to shift downward, somewhere in the neighborhood of June of 2009, we started to see some life, and then it slowly began heading north. We're now 14 months into this, and we see no end in sight. And Cass and a number of the economic guys out there seem to think that we're not going to see anything at least until mid part of this year. And I think that tells us a lot about why we saw so many trucking failures in 2019. Matter of fact, just some quick statistics, and the entire 2019 is not out yet. But just if we compare 2018 to 2019, the first 6 months, 640 trucking companies failed in 2019 in the first 6 months, compared to 310 in 2018. And it was starting to accelerate as we hit mid-year. And I would make the contention that because we were 8 months into this downturn at that point, which now was cresting into uncharted territory as far as the longest downturn that we've experienced in 25 years. So it's pretty scary out there.
You're giving us quite a contrast to the official mainstream or government story of the greatest economy of all time. That's not what you're seeing.
Well, our experience has always been the same. When trucking starts heading south and we get into a downturn, we have never seen a downturn that hasn't affected the general economy, at some point at the other side of that downturn. And if this happens to be the longest downturn we've experienced in 25 years, I'm a little nervous about what this could mean for the general economy. because it's been a bloodbath, literally a bloodbath in the world of trucking. And if all you have to do is Google it, and you'll spend the next few hours just reading, how much of an effect this downturn has had.
You reached out in late 2019 to us to talk about the fact that there was one of the largest trucking companies in the country in Indiana that failed. You said there's multiple dynamics that were behind that, but this downturn in the volume and availability of shipments and so on was a factor that probably didn't help and contributed to that. And you mentioned that there's record numbers of trucking companies failing. Anything else perspective we need to understand about that large company that failed?
Obviously they had some very questionable accounting practices, and some of their C-level folks are going to more than likely do some time, on account of it. But I do believe that because of the current status within the trucking environment and how rates are historically low, volumes are historically low, and again getting worse. There's still no end in sight. There's no doubt in my mind that their decision to shut the company down was economic. Certainly, they probably were going to be facing some serious lawsuit, litigation on account of all these, issues that their leadership unfortunately, partook in. But you could just, if you look at some of the large company failures in 2019, Celadon is just the tip of the iceberg. And there's various reasons for that, but we saw multiple 1,000 truck operations shut down. Folks that have been in business for 2 and 3 generations, and beyond. Folks that are in some of these locations were Staples housing and quite thousands of drivers shutting down this year, and it was across the spectrum. Everything from the oil market to your basic truckload to some reefer companies. Certainly the change in the philosophy change in some of the major automotive companies, moving out of the sedan market and shutting down a number of their plants had serious effects as well. But that's just coupled with the general trucking environment that's just struggling right now as it is. And then you add some of that other stuff. It's just devastating for some of these folks. But, without question, the state of affairs in trucking have a lot to do with it.
Okay, so besides the overall robustness of the manufacturing economy, what other factors another one that was asked by one of our viewers, for example, Portillo family asks, to the, quote, awakened layman, it appears that there is a conscious effort to push out the trucking industry and move towards an AI transportation system, along with a push to a higher volume of freight moved by rail. Do you see this as an accurate assessment?
The space that we see the most artificial intelligence is in the logistics management side. And so, there's been a large shift in 3PL. So we have if you're not familiar with what a 3PL is, so there's companies out there that are called third-party logistics services, and essentially they're, a large office of folks that have expertise in basically across various modes of transportation. And if you're a shipper or manufacturer, you could go to one of these 3PLs and they could manage the whole book of business that you have. And because of their buying power and the fact that they're already set up with thousands of carriers across the United States, they typically are cheaper than you doing it yourself and paying the employees to do that, along with an expertise that does it well. Well, in that space, there is a large push for AI because there's a lot of things that a robot, if you will, and that's what they call it in the industry, a robot can do, like call and make appointments, as an example, because a lot of the shipping requirements, depending upon who you're delivering to, might require you to call, sign up on a website, and actually schedule an appointment for the driver to come in and deliver it. I would ultimately make the contention that that's actually helpful to the industry because it does make it more efficient. However, trucking in general is not really built on efficiencies. It usually isn't very efficient in the long run, especially across modes. But it does actually help improve the amount of downtime between shipments, which improves driver experience and driver pay. So all those things we see, quite frankly, as a benefit to the industry. But it really doesn't affect, the marketplace in terms of available freight, because until we have driverless trucks out there, it still requires a driver to go from A to B, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So based on your past experience, it sounds like you're saying that not only is there a significant downturn, but it's lasting significantly longer than it has in the past. And so what does that bring you to conclude about what you're thinking about the depth of the impact on the real economy and what it's indicating?
Well, to be honest with you, Dunagun, we're very confused at the moment because we're in uncharted territory. We've never seen it go this long. We do believe that the tariff and the whole issue with China has affected us. We just can't put our finger on to what degree because we haven't experienced this long of a downturn. And you're right. If you talk to some of these other industries outside of, say, manufacturing, in particular automotive, their experience is different right now. Matter of fact, 2019 for some of these industries were record years, in terms of historical perspective. So, given that and the length of time that we've been seeing this and the fact that we have yet to see any shift, and then to add to it, historically, the first quarter of the year is the worst quarter of the year. So we're coming out of a very weak year, heading into what's always expected to be, a rough start to the year. It's I hate to overuse a term that you keep hearing out there, but it is a perfect storm. So really, from a trucking company perspective, it's about survival right now, because we do believe, we've never yet seen a downturn that doesn't have another side, an improved side, an uptick, move north, whatever you want to call it. So we do believe, at least we hope that this does have that, because ultimately we're just trying to make it to the other side. Because usually when you do make it to the other side, it's a lot more fun. I would like to say, because there's more business there and there's less folks in the playing field. But getting to the other side right now is the big question mark.
In 2008, 2009, 2010, when we were going through that global financial collapse, did you see sort of cascade effects where because there was a downturn in manufacturing, a downturn in shipping, and people were getting laid off from manufacturing jobs, et cetera, or people were losing their houses because of the financial upending of the mortgage industry and so on, that there was sort of this ripple effects where it seemed to have a one wave of issues then caused a second wave of issues and that sort of thing. And are you seeing that again now, if you did before?
So that's a great question. So, whenever you start to experience a downturn, one of the aspects that you expect to follow is an increased driver turnover. And the main reason for that is, and it does depend on what side of the market you're on. There's two basic sides. There's the contract market, where you contract with a shipper or a manufacturer of some sort, where you're basically doing the same freight lanes that might be dedicated with the same truck even, or it's just you have a bunch of dedicated work that's contracted. And then there's the spot market, and the spot market is a shipper comes out with a particular shipment, and it's going to be based on whatever the market's charging at the time. In 2008 and 2009, I was part of the spot market. And, once you hit 2 or 3 months into a downturn, you start to exacerbate. Basically, you're bleeding drivers out because you can't keep them as busy as you used to. And in the driver world, they begin to think it's the company that they're working for that's the problem. And, there's always been a driver shortage, at least in the last 20 years or so. And the average age of the driver population continues to go up because it's not a very sexy lifestyle, so there's not a lot of new folks coming into the industry, so they just continue to get older each year. So as they retire, obviously there's less drivers in the pool. So with that said, there's a driver that's professional that has a great driving record, can almost just about get a job anywhere. and there's always work for them. So it allows movement, and that, when you don't get the miles that you were getting, or maybe the rates that have declined, so you're not making as much money per mile, you're going to look elsewhere because you think it's the company. And then as that continues, another 2 or 3 months in, then the industry realizes from the driver's perspective that this is not the company that they're working for, that it's more global in the industry, if you will. So they tend to hunker down. We experienced that same thing in 2019. Get probably in the April, May area. Turnover was really high, and that continued till about August. And then, then it realized that, hey, the industry as a whole, it's happening. So we're going to kind of hunker down and see how we can make it work where we're at, which has its own side effect, because then, you've been fighting this driver turnover these last 5-6 months, and now folks want to hunker down. So you're still trying to fill trucks. So it's a real tug of war, in this kind of situation. But now we're 14 months in. The only thing probably saving us right now from a driver turnover perspective is everyone's speaking the same language. Everybody's talking about the same thing. And so they know that movement would probably be less beneficial to them. So they're on the wait and see mode as well. So those tend to be the side effects. But, again, like I said, we're in uncharted territories, Dunagun. So, we are hoping that we start to see a shift sometime here in 2020. But, I have to probably mention this. One of the other disruptors out there in the industry happens when we have a presidential election. So the year leading up to an election, which now that we're here in 2020, that has its own disruption effect. So, we're already in this crazy, I don't know, just downturn, trucking world, and then we're going to add a presidential election where, it's got us a little nervous.
So it sounds like, if I can summarize what I'm hearing, is you're seeing the longest downturn in the trucking industry that you've ever seen in decades of being an insider in that. And that's causing you, first of all, to have to take extreme measures of how you're managing so that you're not one of those casualties, because you're seeing also record numbers of companies that are going out of business in the trucking industry. But could you talk to us about what you believe it's indicating about the real economy, and do you see, either on a personal level or with the people that you talk with, and you mentioned drivers as employees wanting to not hop around or shop between employers because they sense that it's not just an employer's problem, it's the whole industry, it's the whole global economy. What about measures that either you're taking personally, or you're taking as a company, or you're talking with other people that are taking to protect themselves from the coming storm economically?
Yeah, so we're expecting 2020 to be a lot like 2019. And at this point, that's probably the best we can do. So what we've done, what a lot of trucking companies do in these, at least in a normal downturn, and that's allow your expenses to meet your expected, and that's we're very conservative with how we're approaching our budget for 2020. So we've secured ourselves for the next 2 cycles. One of the things that really affect trucking companies as a whole is that it's a very cash-based environment, right? And that's one of the reasons why when you have, sharp ups and sharp downs, it can actually be much more detrimental than a long, steady, either up or down, or a combination of the two, because you can make your adjustments, as that, ebbs and flows. But when you have these sharp or long periods of decline, where it's just straight down, in this case, since November of 2018, there's just not enough time to react to it. So we're doing what a lot of folks do, and that's we're tightening our belt. We cut expenses where we could, and we're going into 2020, or we came into 2020 very lean, and we'll adjust up as necessary, if we do start to see an uptick. But Dunagun, we talk about this every day, and we really think that what we're experiencing in transportation, if it doesn't come to the general economy, it's going to be the first time we've ever experienced that. So with that historical perspective, if it's this dismal in the trucking world, I can't imagine, what it's going to mean to the general economy, and I think folks should be ready for that.
Would you be willing to share with us any actions you've taken on the personal side? Have this spilled over from your business life into your personal life as far as economic preparedness?
Well, I'm personally expecting this to be bad in the general economy side. So, I'm not a stranger to some of the other economic predictors out there. Done again with some of the folks that you have had on your show. We're preparing. We're preparing for what I'm thinking could be pretty disastrous. And so, all the things that you would expect to prepare for, we're doing that personally.
Interesting that you guys often see things before people notice it in the mainstream economy.
It works both ways, though. As things start to go up, when the rest of the economy is still down.
You're a leading indicator.
It's always been on both sides of the coin.
We see. Okay.
We see the crash before it happens every single time. Sometimes though it's there's a lot of ups and downs throughout the years, right? So we talk about these major events like when that technology bubble was a big one. 2001 when 9/11 happened, that was another big one. The main reason is, first of all, it shook the nation. Number two, they shut down the airports, so there was no planes flying for 2 weeks. So it had a major disruption in the industry. And 2001 as a whole became one of the historical bad years. And I'm sure that to no less effect of that. But anyway, that was a different situation, right? That wasn't one that had a natural cycle. It was a major disruption.
Right.
But every other one but 2001 came first. And you can sense it. You really can, especially when you have trucks and you start to see their miles ebb and flow. But once you realize that something's not just a hiccup, because you can have a bad month that just creeps in out of nowhere, and it might be. There's always a reason for it, but it's not a larger reason in the industry. It's just meaning maybe there was a disruption in Hong Kong. They're doing all these protests. Which I think is an indicator that what's going on in China is worse than they're obviously talking about. Because I think that on the surface, that's showing what's probably really going on underneath the hood. But we don't do a lot of global market, but that global market affects some of the domestic transportation volumes, right? Because we're bringing in these containers from overseas. And this whole China thing has significantly affected certain markets that we kind of, take for granted, which have kind of dried up, and I got a buddy who's locally here that works for the largest insurance broker. I don't know if I was telling you this before, but he works for the largest insurance broker. He's a structural engineer, and his major clients are clients like Honda, Cardinal Health, Eaton Corporation, right? Large multinational companies. And he said the conversation wherever he goes, and he's in these manufacturing plants because he's doing these, secure or safety assessments on how different things they can do within the manufacturing plant, to cut their risks in various areas, mostly on the structural side. But that said, the overarching conversation is tariffs. And they said that many of their projects, they won't get kicked off the ground if they can't guess what, if they can't get it kicked off the ground from 0 to 30 days, because 30 days is the most that they can secure from a tariff perspective. And since there's so much disruption and uncertainty in the tariff world, they're just not getting these projects off the ground, and which obviously turns into less freight on the ground because they're not doing them. So you couple that with what we're seeing, it's nerve-wracking, man.
Well, we really appreciate your coming on the show here and also having reached out to us as you saw changes happening in the industry. Always appreciate it when our viewers as well find a way to share the perspectives that they have firsthand of what's going on, because it helps us all to be more aware, and when that means we can all be more prepared for what's happening. Just want to thank you for your generosity at joining us. We've been speaking with a trucking industry insider who came forward to share with us what you're not hearing about on the mainstream financial channels about what's really going on the ground, and just want to thank you for joining us this first time on Finance and Liberty and Reluctant Preppers.
Hey, love everything you do, Don. Again, thanks for having me, and I hope I'm wrong.
They say the stock market crashed today.
Yeah, I heard that.
Sounds like people's retirement accounts and savings accounts are going to get bailed into the banks.
Yeah.
Looks like pension plans and Social Security are going to get suspended too.
I know.
Sure, I'm glad we decided to put our money into gold and silver instead.
Me too.
Get your gold and silver and support this channel at goldsilver.com/?AFF=RP. Reluctant Preppers provides educational awareness and commentary only. Opinions expressed do not constitute personalized financial advice. Viewers are encouraged to do their own research and seek qualified personal financial consultation before making investment decisions.